Champaign County Agriculture Today with your host, Dennis Riggs.
Hello and welcome to Champaign County Agriculture Today. My name is Dennis Riggs, your host for the next few minutes as we talk about some really important issues here in Champaign County agriculture. You know, agriculture is one of those things that everybody's affected by it, usually about 3 times a day. We have our breakfast, we have our noon meal, and we have our evening meal. And you think about, where is that food coming from? You know, who are the people that actually produce the food that we enjoy and makes us healthy and a great nation that we are? Well, of course, that's agriculture. And agriculture has a great history. It's one of those very basic industries that have been around for years and years. Our country was founded upon it. And we're going to find out more about that history of agriculture here in Central Illinois and in the state of Illinois today with a great guest I can't wait to get started talking to. And that guest today is Deborah Reed.
Hello.
Deborah is here from Eastern Illinois University, where she's a professor, also an adjunct professor at the University of Illinois. It sounds like you've got a great background there. Thanks for being with us today.
You're most welcome.
Deborah, let's start off. A lot of people know that I have a farming background and still farm today. I understand also you have a farming background. Tell us about the history of Deborah Reed first.
Well, I grew up on a farm in southern Illinois in Randolph County, right near the Mississippi River, a couple hours south of St. Louis, an hour north of Cairo. It was a very small, diversified operation, hogs, feeder calves. It kept us busy. Haying was just my greatest joy when I was a child. So it was hard to move on, but when I went to college, I've lived in 8 states and a foreign country since then, and then managed to make it back to Illinois when I was hired at Eastern.
Very good. So a great farm background and understand it and still farm in your family today.
Yeah.
Tell us what you do with the universities, working for 2 universities. That's pretty good. What's your jobs there?
Keeps me busy. Eastern, I was hired to teach in a graduate program in historical administration, museum studies, and a lot of the students I train end up working in living history farms in this state and other states. I also teach U.S. history, and then I was forward one day and contacted the Ag, Consumer, and Environmental Sciences College at U of I and said, would the land grant like to do a history of ag course? And they thought that they might, so we put one together, and this fall semester is the 5th time that I've taught the course in the history of Illinois agriculture since 1860.
Wow, that's fantastic. And if nobody's ever been to a living history farm, museum, farm / whatever you call it, they really need to go. Give me a couple of examples in the Midwest of those facilities.
One of the closest is Conner Prairie, which is over north of Indianapolis. And it's a large operation with a couple different farms from the 1830s and 1880s. Lincoln Log Cabin, just south of Charleston, is the home of Lincoln's father and stepmother. It depicts the 1830s, or 1845 agriculture in Illinois. In Chicago area, there's Vulcaning Living History Farm in Schaumburg and Wagner Farm in Glenview, both of which, one shows 1880s Germans, the other 1920s Germans, and dairy farming in Cook County. So wide range, and one of the only places that folks can really get access, you know, to agriculture. Not everybody can go to a farm, but everybody can go to a living history farm.
Tell me the difference between that and like over at New Salem Park in Springfield.
New Salem is another example. It's more of the village focus, more representative of the communities that had to be formed to keep the agriculture viable in the early years, 1830s.
One that I've been to is out in Des Moines, Iowa, the Living History Farm out there. I'm sure you're familiar with it.
Living History Farm's a great place. Yep, created during the 1970s by various professors who worked with Illinois State, or Iowa State University. And yeah, Farm Progress Show people should stop by.
Absolutely. Well, the thing about a facility like that, and people think, well, gosh, why would I ever want to visit that? If you've got kids or you yourself have any interest in agriculture at all, first of all, the older folks would want the interest in agriculture. The kids will be absolutely amazed by the processes that early agriculture went through in the process of raising food. So it's a great place to take kids. There's a lot of activity. There's no video games. It's wonderful.
Right.
Well, very good. Well, speaking of that, history, of course, is so important for us to remember where we've come from so we know a little bit about where we're going. Give me a quick beginning, and we're going to have a slide number 1 that we're going to go to here in just a second. But it's of course, this is originally prairie. We are foreigners to this soil. Let's go to slide number 1 and see if that will get us started on the history of agriculture here in Illinois. Yeah. Explain to me what we're looking at here.
The chief of the Illinois nation is there with his dart or spear and pipe. And he's the diplomat. He's the leader of the Illinois Indians as of 1701 when he was depicted by a French, a Frenchman. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure what the Frenchman's official duty was. He's the diplomat, he's the negotiator, he's the public presence for the nation. He's not the farmer. The farmer were the women the family that he married into in all likelihood. The women were the ones who were stewards of the land, managed the agricultural processes, knew how much to plant, managed all the harvesting and all the cashing of the corn and beans and other commodities, fruits, nuts, whatever they harvested. So, and they were stewards of the land. They were semi-permanent agriculturalists.
So we're saying that the ladies were actually the first true farmers who tilled the soil and raised the crops. Mm-hmm. Wow, okay. How long did that last?
Until contact. By 1832, the native people are removed from the east of the Mississippi River, mm-hmm. and 1833 is Champaign County's formation, if I'm correct in that.
Okay.
So by the time folks begin to come into this area from the eastern United States or from foreign countries, Germany, England, there aren't any Illini or Illinois Indians of various persuasions in this area anymore. But the ways that the colonizers arrived and the kinds of villages and communities they established were very similar to what the Indians had, and that they all were dependent upon these small communities.
So early on, in the Indian era culture, the ladies tilled the soil, did the agricultural pursuit, and that maintained. When you said contact, explain what you mean by the word contact. Is that a demarcation line?
Well, a contact. There was no line. It ebbed and flowed for a century and a half, from the time the French had first arrived in the late 1600s until the 1830s, when national policy was such that Indians needed to be removed, justified to protect the native civilizations. If they weren't removed, they figured that they would cease to exist. And the Indians protested vigorously, vehemently,
right.
Not wanting to leave their home. Mm-hmm. But they were forcibly removed or had already ceased to exist.
The development of the United States, that time in our period is kind of ugly to look back on sometimes, but it is a true thing that happened. Now, is this tribe that we're talking about, the Illinois tribe, is it the formation we talk about? Everybody's talking about the chief and the University of Illinois. That is the group that we're talking about there.
Well,
or not?
I'm not an anthropologist, so
Okay.
I'll beg to not make a statement about that. In general, there were native peoples of different groups.
Uh-huh.
And the descent from whom they descended and what their descendants who they are today, members of what federally nationally recognized tribe, mm-hmm. I wouldn't speculate. There are experts who know.
Not a lot of interest, but not a lot of good facts, documentation that we can use.
Well, they were very different people in that they didn't have the written record, and their method of memory and their method of connections differed radically from those who came after them. So what those who came after respect as evidence is not necessarily what the native peoples respected as evidence.
Okay, interesting beginning. Great way to get started. Let's go on to that next step then. Mm-hmm. As the contact was made and as the culture changed, what was the first evidence of agriculture we have that we can look back on, basically from that new point of the non-Indian phase?
Well, the settlers found land that they which is the same land that the natives had found productive. In many instances, it was river bottoms and wooded land and prairie. They avoided the swamp at all cost. They knew that they needed to have wood for homes and fuel, fences, which was a huge commitment, fencing cattle and other stock out of crops as opposed to fencing stock in. And they developed settlements in very much the same places that native people had lived.
So a lot of times the towns or where the civilization camped out was the same. It just went from the Indian settlement to the new settlers. Okay.
And then as people began to be more established, they began to devise technological plows that would break the prairie and make the prairie tillable, drainage systems that could, drain the water off the otherwise incredibly wet soil that the Indians had always, realized was there and not drained, that the French commented on when they were in the area in the early 1700s, late 16 and early 1700s. So the technology changes a bit, and it allows the people to begin to manipulate the land in different ways.
Let's talk about the natural resources. Agriculture has had its roots, if you will, excuse the pun possibly, here in East Central Illinois and in Illinois for many, many years. Why is that?
Well, I think that anywhere there's land, there has to be, natural resources exist either for people to use or for people to protect. So I believe, and there have been plenty of histories written trying to figure out, did people come to exploit the natural resources or did they come to protect them? And knowing that that was where their nutrition, their sustenance lay. And we remain divided about this. Certainly there were people who arrive in a place and they realize the bounty or the potential bounty of an area and they invest their entire life in it. Those people are not going to just destroy it. They're not going to overplow. They're not going to, use it up and wear it out. And then there are other people who might be more exploitive, speculators, and they're going to come in clear and hope that someone else will, move in after them. They can make a profit and move on. Both approaches existed in this area.
And still do today, probably, if you actually take a look at it. Very interesting thought there. But the main thing is a lot of settlers brought their families here because they could actually survive. They had open prairie, they had the fields to plow, and it was the natural resources that allowed them to be farmers.
Right.
What type of farmers were they?
Diversified, sustenance. Self-sufficiency is a term I like to avoid because I believe from the time that this county would have been formed, mid-1830s, there was already markets established. You could, from here, you could go east, you could go north, you could go south in terms of produce, mostly east from here. So there was a lot of interest in growing marketable crops, but fundamentally people had to feed themselves. So they're not just focused on self-sufficiency, but that's what drives them because they know they won't survive if they don't, raise enough corn for themselves, process in whatever ways enough fruit and vegetables so that they can make it through winters.
A lot of the early farmers probably didn't understand the word entrepreneur, but they actually were.
Well, I think a lot did understand it.
Cool.
When you look at the public land records are all available digitally through the Secretary of State's office. They have wonderful resources. And so you can, you have a name, you can plug in the name to the statewide index of public land sales and pull up who bought public lands in Champaign County, how much they bought, how much they paid. And people were not just buying, a quarter section or a half section. I mean, if they could afford it, they bought as much as they could. For various reasons. Culturally, they wanted to make sure their children had an inheritance, and they wanted to make sure that they have their resources. They're going to put it into something that they know, and that's farming.
Very good. We'll tell you what, we're going to take a short break here, but when we come back, we're going to talk more about the development and how that proceeded on in the years leading more toward the future, but we're going to stay in the past. Very good. Well, hang on. We'll be right back. Talk more about the development of Champaign County and East Central Illinois agriculture on Champaign County Agriculture Today.
There were originally 15 townships in Champaign County. These townships were East Bend, Hale, Middle Fork, Middletown, Newcomb, Para, Pleasant Hill, Urbana, Rantoul, Sedoris, Sidney, South Homer, St. Joseph, Tolono, and West Urbana. Today, Champaign County consists of 30 townships.
Welcome back to Champaign County Agriculture Today, where we're learning about the history of Champaign County agriculture. And with me is Deborah Reed. Deborah, we're having a great time talking about the history of Champaign County. I'm learning a lot. I'm sure our viewers are as well. Let's talk about as this area developed, and not just Champaign County, but this whole area. As the settlers came in, they were settling on, as settlers will do most times, areas that were most productive, were not swamp areas where they could actually sustain their existence. But they were also learning how to farm here in this new prairie.
Right.
We have a slide that we're going to put up, we call it slide number 2 here, about a group of people learning about agriculture. Tell us about this slide here.
Well, we have leaped forward several decades. In 1909, this image shows the corn class at the University of Illinois. And just quick background information regarding images like that. By 1860, has been considerable interest in trying to help farmers be better farmers. And that's everything from growing better stock and better crops to knowing, better fertilizing techniques and how to market better. So there were a lot of farmers' institutes created, and the state of Illinois supported that, and there were farmers' institutes right here in Champaign, in different towns and also at the county level. So out of this effort to improve agriculture generally comes an effort on the part of the national government to create land grant institutions. And in 1862, Abraham Lincoln signs the Morrill Land Grant Act, which creates a public fund based on public land sales in any given state to underwrite higher education, particularly for farmers.
Were there property taxes back then?
Oh, gory, that's a question. Yes, there were
but this was
various types of taxes.
This is separate than a tax type of thing.
Totally separate. Property taxes is locally assessed, county assessed, and this was not an individual assessment that the national government imposed to fund this college. It was public land sales that the government established for a state, and then that state could do what it wanted to do with that land. Sell it, retain it, but somehow the state had to match the federal investment in the public land. And from that emerged these land grant institutions. So the U of I is the land grant institution. Its agricultural curriculum starts in the, I think, early 1870s. And eventually the College of Agriculture seeks to dominate but doesn't. I mean, there's a lot of other education that rural people want, not just agriculture. But by 1909, there's in the progressive era of agriculture an interest in training youth more aggressively and training older farmers who missed out on college educations how to be better farmers. So that's how these corn clubs and corn classes originate. So farmers in farmers' institutes all over the state could come to the University of Illinois and take classes with these agricultural experts.
The land grant college, University of Illinois, was that restricted to one per state, one per area? How were those originally set up?
Originally, the 1862 enabling legislation set up one in a state. The Civil War was raging at the time, though, and that kind of complicated things in terms of what would the Confederate states do. And I mean, I know that's far off topic from Champaign County, but in 1890, there was a second Morrill Land Grant Act, and that established traditionally black land grant colleges throughout all former Confederate states and beyond those Confederate states. So there are actually, in most states, 2 land grant colleges, one established by the 1860 legislation or 1862 legislation and one by the 1890 legislation.
But of course, the common thread that runs through both of those is learning how to farm better, how to become more productive, because at that point in time, everybody realized that subsistence comes from the farm, whether we're talking about food or fiber. Not so much fuel back then. Of course, we've turned that chapter here just in recent years, although back then, were there any other products from the farm that were common to everybody? Food and fiber being the main ones.
Food and fiber, yeah.
That was the main things at that point in time.
At that point, what point? Because by 1909, when this image of the corn class was taken, you had several decades of experimentation with what to do with corn, for example. I mean, can it be used for paint? Can it be used for fuel? And then by the 1909 period and immediately thereafter, you begin to see a lot of effort put into soybean research. And what can that oil be used for? Can any of this be used to replace gutta percha or rubber, for example? So there was a lot of experimentation going on in different uses for the same staple crop.
Was most of the education, however, on a yield basis on how to grow better crops, not necessarily the usage thereof?
Correct. Increased production. And this, this assumes that farmers need this information. A lot of farmers didn't think that they needed the information. So lest we think that there was a, unanimous support for this kind of progressive agricultural education, there really wasn't. A lot of farmers resisted it, resented it, did not participate. But what happens out of these corn classes and out of the emergence of, after 1914, the emergence of the Extension Service, which is also directly tied to the land grants, you begin to see farmers that are more predisposed to participating in these kinds of public programs and educational opportunities. And then you get more participation in things like the public programs of the Depression era. That's a predisposed population, but it is by no means the whole farm population.
Farmers have always been a very independent lot and forward-thinking. We're going to take a short break right now, but when we come back, we're going to talk about one of those such farmers who was very forward-thinking and did a lot of interesting things. As a matter of fact, he was so forward-thinking, they named a town after him. Find out what that town is. We'll be right back.
Abraham Lincoln made his last speech before assuming the presidency just south of Champaign in Tolono in February of 1861.
Welcome back to Champaign County Agriculture Today as we learn more about the history of agriculture here in East Central Illinois. Right before the break, we were talking about how farmers were pretty much independent and did a lot of thinking outside the box. There was a farmer, Deborah, I understand, down in the Sodorus area by the name of Frank.
Yes.
And Frank did a lot of interesting things. Tell us what you know about a fellow by the name of Frank down in that area.
Frank Sodorus was a young man that was definitely enamored of photography. And between 1907 and 1917, he took a lot of photographs on glass plate negatives that documented the area and his family farming. Now, he was the youth in the family. His grandfather had helped establish, I assume, the town of Sodorus. I know less about the family history. But what Frank does is document agriculture in this county, at least on his farm, during the golden age of agriculture.
We are remiss if we don't start in with some pictures. We're going to bring up picture number 3 here. And that brings Mr. Frank Sodorus, and yes, that is a corn belt that he's wearing. Tell me more about, what do you know about this picture?
Well, he was quite the humorist. His photos often posed, but always showed some sense of humor, and I think this has got to be the best one. Here, smack dab in the middle of the corn belt, right, is Frank with his corn belt. And look at those ears of corn. I mean,
huge.
Very, and probably funk. Select seed, because he had still lifes that he did trying to mimic the advertising of seed companies, including Funk. So
there you go. Well, Frank sounds like an interesting guy. Let's go on to slide number 4. Let's give a little bit more complimentary look at Frank Sodorus. Tell me what he did in agriculture.
Undoubtedly a self-portrait. He would have been like many young men at this time. The golden age of agriculture was a period in which there was excessive income for farmers. And yet his grandfather is aging. His brothers are not, and his parents not inclined or less inclined to stay in farming. Frank was desperate to stay on the farm, and was undoubtedly some sort of family controversy that led to the eventual sale of the farm. But here you see Frank in a rather reflective mode, I guess. There's been a lot of work done on these Sodorus photographs. They're exhibited at the Illinois State Museum, and Ray Beal has done a video with WILL TV.
Okay,
So the quiet upon the land, or upon a quiet landscape.
Now, did Mr. Sidoris do a lot as far as the development of agriculture, or he's just one of the farmers that is better documented than many others?
Better documented because of Frank's photographs, and which happened to survive despite a total lack of care. They were abandoned in an attic, I think, and found eventually. But they were positioned strategically. The farm was very close to the, I believe, the Illinois Central Rail line, which offers the market opportunities that the farmers needed. There was at least a, if not a depot, a water station for the steam engines. So a market opportunity, and very close to places like Champaign, which likewise furthered market opportunities, and that's what helps make people survive, or help people survive and prosper during this era.
In just the couple of minutes we've got left, as we talk about agriculture and its development, if you would meet a farmer from back then, what type of conversation do you think that that farmer would like to have with you?
Well, I think they'd want to tell me about how much they worked, how hard they worked. And there are some images that indicate the family reaping, reaping grain, making hay, the fences they built. So I think they'd want to tell me, just to make me realize how physically demanding farming was in the, an industrial age, but certainly still a horse draft power age.
How do you see that different from today? I know you work with farmers, you have farmers close to your home farm down south. Is there a difference, other than the technology, obviously, about farmers back then as farmers today?
I think it's still a physically demanding job, but I think the capitalization that has happened with agriculture is the distinct change, and the ways that farmers, they've always been businessmen, they've always been independent businessmen, in my humble opinion, but the degree to which their business, the scale of their business can be so much greater and more complex, I think, today, given the different audiences that they have to market themselves to.
So mechanization, capitalization, how much money it takes to run a farming operation, and also technology. Is that the main three differences? The thing that's the same is we still grow crops in the soil.
Right.
And I guess you're never going to get around that, are there? All right.
I don't think so.
Very good.
Hydroponics might differ.
Well, that's true. There's where technology has taken us away from the soil and be completely different. But the history of agriculture is rich, and I thank you for looking into it.
You're welcome.
Good to have you with us today, Deborah. In just a little bit of time we got left, we want to encourage people to stay tuned, because we are going to have another program with Deborah. We're going to talk about the farm organizations and the development of policy in agriculture, and how that has affected all of us, actually, that consume food. So we thank you for watching. We hope you'll tune in again when we have a chance to tell you what's going on in Champaign County agriculture today. I'm Dennis Riggs, your host, and we'll see you next time right here.
Champaign County Agriculture Today is brought to you by Champaign County Farm Bureau.